Welcome. Good day. We're so glad you could join us in this continuing live stream series. Everything's on live stream or Zoom or something these days. For politics, as we find it, sometimes we have a guest who's a politician, and sometimes we have a guest who's a journalist, and sometimes we have a guest who's an author of a great new book. And we've got both a journalist and an author of a great new book here with us today. And we're so pleased to welcome Molly Ball. Let me introduce Molly, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss, the two of us, and then with your questions, her wonderful new book, well-written new book. I urge you to get it, new book, Pelosi. And you don't have to ask who Pelosi is. You know this is a book about Nancy Pelosi, one of the most interesting figures on the American scene today. Molly Ball is the national political correspondent at Time Magazine, where she covers national politics. In 2012, she was awarded the Toner Prize, named after Robin Toner, wonderful reporter for the Post and the New York Times, who unfortunately has passed on. The Toner Prize for excellence in political reporting for her coverage of the presidential campaign of that year, the Obama-Romney campaign. Molly previously reported, and listen to this list here, she reported for Politico. She reported for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, which is when I first talked to you, I believe, or maybe it was the Las Vegas Sun. She worked for newspapers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Cambodia. Cambodia is on the list here, as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. That's quite a resume for someone so young. She graduated from Yale University in 2001 with a bachelor's degree in English and literature. And she's the author of this fascinating new book published by Henry Holt, an outstanding publisher, outstanding New York publisher, about the 52nd Speaker of the House of Representatives. Welcome, Molly. It is a great pleasure for us to have you here, and we're sharing this with thousands and thousands of people who are on this live stream. Now, granted, some of them have to tune in because they're students and they'll be taking an exam on this. Doesn't that make you feel good? We'll construct some questions.
Try to make it as painless as possible. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here with you.
Well, we're thrilled to do it. And I'll add a personal note. Naturally, and given what I do, I watch tons of TV analysis programs, more than is healthy or wise. But I do watch them, and you're on a lot of them from time to time. And this is the honest to God truth. I have tenure, so flattery is unnecessary. I can't be fired. I listen to you when you're on. I stop what I'm doing and listen to your comments because you actually add something to the discussion. Data, facts. It isn't just opinion. And I think it's wonderful. We need more experienced journalists like you doing this kind of work, not just on television, but in other media as well.
Thank you so much, Larry.
It's true, Molly.
And if I can return the compliment, there's plenty of so-called political analysts that reporters sometimes quote in their stories, but just as you just said, I always learn something from talking to you about whatever it is I'm covering, even if I think I already know it.
Well, you're very kind, and people say that a lot because I'm getting up there and could die on any day. So I appreciate so much you're making that observation. You never know when your last day is. Anyway, Molly, I was fascinated with this book because we think we know Nancy Pelosi. She's been speaker on two different stints and a very prominent figure for a long, long time. But you have information and material in this book about, well, really every phase of her life, but particularly how she grew up in a political family and how she adapted to becoming a candidate. She didn't run for anything until 87, was it?
Yep,
Mid-80s.
She was 47 when she made her first run for office.
That's really remarkable. Tell us what surprised you the most about what you learned about the young Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, well, one of the things I tried to do in this book was focus on what she learned from her mother. There's obviously been a lot of attention on on the heritage that she got from her father. Her father was a congressman and the mayor of Baltimore, and obviously she went into the family business, so it's natural to focus on how her political style parallels her father's, and her older brother also went into the family business and became the mayor of Baltimore. He just died last year. They were very close. Uh, but from the first time that I interviewed her, which was 2 years ago, she's always emphasized the contributions of her mother as well. And I think you can see why that is. First of all, because motherhood is so important to Nancy Pelosi and to her life. She feels that the experience of being a mother really shaped her and gave her a lot of those political skills that we see in action in the House. Because after all, toddlers and politicians have a lot in common. They're both maniacs whose demands you have to balance and satisfy and find ways to get them to do what you want. But also, I think, as a woman, she saw from an early age the way that her mother was stifled and the things that her mother was not allowed to do, the dreams her mother was not allowed to fulfill. Her mother wanted to go to law school. She wasn't able to because of family obligations. She wanted to be an auctioneer. She had a business that she wanted to expand, but she needed her husband's signature and he wouldn't give it to her. And in those days, if you were a woman and wanted to go into business, you had to have your husband's signature on the checks. So it's interesting to me how frank Nancy Pelosi is in talking about all this. She's not trying to paper over the difficulties that she saw her mother go through. And then the last thing I'd say about that is you can definitely see a lot of parallels in their personalities. Her mother was a very strong-willed woman, very fiery. I don't want to be stereotypical, but she was a classic sort of Italian wife and mother who ran the household with an iron fist. She ran a lot of the political operation as well. That Baltimore Women's Democratic Club that she ran out of the basement of their row house in Little Italy was crucial to delivering the votes for Mayor D'Alessandro. So she was really a partner in the operation. And I think Nancy Pelosi feels that because she didn't have that title in front of her name, mayor, congressman, her contributions haven't been significantly appreciated, but she contributed a lot to Nancy Pelosi as she grew up.
That was to me one of the most interesting parts because I don't think I've ever read much about her mother. It's always about her father, the mayor of Baltimore, and it was, as you said, the family business in Baltimore. And back then, Baltimore played a bigger role in Democratic politics than it does today. The mayor of Baltimore was a very significant figure. So she absorbed a lot of political lessons from her father, no doubt. But her mother was the role model that undoubtedly she needed to become the most powerful woman in American politics, which she was, at least until Hillary Clinton was nominated. But Nancy Pelosi is still in office. So, look, going back again to the past, describe how she not just learned about politics or played a role behind the scenes, but how she started to emerge on her own, the things she did in politics to move up in a way that helped her become visible and eventually Speaker of the House.
Yeah, well, so even though she vowed not to follow in her mother's footsteps and become a housewife, that is exactly what she did when she got out of college. Although she did work for a year in the office of Maryland Senator Daniel Brewster alongside a young Steny Hoyer. And they would later become colleagues and rivals, number 1 and 2 in the House. But so she followed her husband, Paul Pelosi, who's in finance. They moved to New York. She had 4 children in quick succession. They moved to his hometown, San Francisco. She had the 5th child. She had 5 children in 6 years, which is pretty overwhelming, and was busy running that household. But she was always politically active. She's literally born into the Democratic Party, and from the time she was a housewife in New York City, she was pushing that stroller and dropping Democratic leaflets under people's doors in their neighborhood in Midtown. And when they moved to San Francisco, she continued to be a very active political volunteer, and she soon became known as a stop on the fundraising circuit. She was a very good fundraiser, and again, there's another business that I think you can see a lot of parallels with the work of a House Speaker in terms of you've got to flatter a lot of people who think they're really important and get them to give you what you want, right? So she became known as a very adept fundraiser. She became friends with a lot of the important California politicians at the time, Leo McCarthy, Philip Burton, and Jerry Brown. And she gradually became more and more significant player in party politics. She was the chair of the California Democratic Party. She helped bring the 1984 convention to San Francisco. She made a failed run for chair of the DNC, and she was finance chair of the senatorial committee. So all that being said, people repeatedly asked her to run for office, and she always said no. She always considered herself sort of a strategist, the guy behind the guy, if you will. And then in 1987, her friend Sala Burton, who had succeeded her late husband, Phil Burton, in Congress. And that was the way most women got to Congress in those days, right? Is they would take their dead husband's seat. But when Sala died, she made her friend Nancy Pelosi promise to run for this seat as she was dying. It was a hard-fought campaign, a tough San Francisco Democratic primary with 14 different candidates. But Nancy Pelosi won that seat in Congress, as I describe in the excerpt on your website today. Everyone can go read it. It's a fascinating campaign. But the upshot of all of that, the reason I provide so much detail, is that by the time she did get to Washington, get to Congress in 1987 in that special election, she already knew a lot of people, and a lot of them owed her favors because she had been such a prolific fundraiser and party operative. So she was able to be effective from the moment her feet hit the ground in Congress.
Well, it's an incredible story. Now, wasn't there a library board involved too in turning her around? She didn't want to take it. What happened there?
I love this story, and she loves this story, and she told me this story, and she's told this story before. So it's 1975. She's a 35-year-old housewife, and she gets a call from the mayor, a fellow Italian-American Democrat, Joe Aliotto. She's been volunteering with the library, and he says, "I want to put you on the library board." But first, actually, the phone rings. She picks it up, and he says, "What are you doing? Cooking a big pot of pasta?" And she's immediately offended, right? She finds this very chauvinistic. He just assumes she's this little Italian housewife stirring a pot on the stove. And also, Nancy Pelosi actually hates to cook. So she said, "No, Mayor, I'm reading the New York Times." She got the New York Times delivered to her every day in San Francisco, and it would come in the late afternoon, and she'd do the crossword puzzle while her kids were taking a nap. So she gets offended that the mayor thinks she's cooking, but then he says, "I want to put you on the library board," and she says, "Oh, that's okay. I like being a volunteer. That's good enough for me. I'm happy to contribute. I don't need an official position." And he reprimanded her. He said, "You're doing the work. You should get the recognition. You should have the influence that you deserve for doing all this work." And that was really a revelation to her. And even though the library board is a quite small time position, an unpaid part-time appointed position in the city, she realized that, as a youngish woman in 1975, nobody necessarily listens to you when you open your mouth. But when you have a vote, they have to. And she realized that because she had that power, people had to deal with her. They had to pay her a certain amount of respect. And she did have the influence and the power that came from the work that she was doing. And I think she sort of never looked back from that point on in working to achieve positions where she could have real influence and power, despite the ways that all of the men in charge might not have taken her seriously.
And Molly, we have many students watching this particular live stream. That's a wonderful lesson for them. This is a go-getter generation, it really is, and they want to go to the top within 1.5 years after graduating. Well, you can't do that. And you never turn down an opportunity like that to get involved. It's like all addictions. You get a taste of it, and before you know, you're an addict. And I think Nancy Pelosi and a million other politicians started that way. Okay, so she's in Congress, and as you properly pointed out, back then, first, there were hardly any women in Congress. It's embarrassing when you look back and see the numbers, just as there were very few minorities in Congress. But in addition to that, a majority of them really did follow their husbands. It was called the widow's mite. The widow normally got the right of first refusal to run for the husband's unexpired term, although she was expected to step down at the end of that term and turn it over to somebody who was a real politician, meaning a man. So she went into a house that was extremely sexist, and yet she's Speaker of the House. She's on her second stint as Speaker of the House. How did this happen? What was the progression?
Yeah, well, there were a few keys to that, and it is really interesting. When she got there in 1987, out of 435 members of the House, there were 23 women. Think about that.
Wow.
So there weren't a lot of sisters that she could go to sort of help her learn the ropes. But the first thing she sort of absorbed was she looked around her. She got to know some of the men around her. She joined this Tuesday night dinner group of politicians, including Chuck Schumer and a bunch of others who would meet and have dinner every week. Uh, and she quickly realized there's no special sauce here. These men aren't any smarter than I am. They don't know anything that I don't. I can, swim in these waters just like anybody else. But the other thing that she did was, the day that she was sworn in, her father, who was then in a wheelchair, uh, went up to the speaker at the time and said she needs to be on appropriations. Uh, and she immediately wanted to get on the committees that were doing the most important work. The appropriations committee that spends all the money. She was later on the banking committee, the ethics committee. She's still the longest serving member of the intelligence committee. And so rather than trying to climb the ladder right away, rather than trying to get into the lower rungs of leadership and work her way up, she really immersed herself in policy. So she really learned the ropes by learning how the federal budget works, learning how legislation gets through, learning all of the tricks of the House and how it runs. And that meant that when there was a potential opening in leadership in 1998, long after the Republican takeover of the House in '94, when that opening came along, her preparation for it was substantive. It wasn't that she was next in line. In fact, a man was next in line. It was Steny Hoyer, and they spent more than 3 years competing for that position because the position would only come open if the Democrats won the House, and the Democrats kept not winning the House. And Nancy Pelosi was very frustrated by that. She looked around and she said to her close confidant George Miller, she said, "I don't think these men know how to win." So part of what she was offering was a new type of leadership, but also uh, she said, we've got to get. Her critique of the Democratic leadership at the time was that it was sort of complacent and old-fashioned and not in a position to get the party back into the majority in the House.
You mentioned Steny Hoyer twice. They're not frenemies; they're friends. But you mentioned that the office situation in the House way back when they were both interns. That was another example of gender bias and sexism, wasn't it? Because she, who probably had more political experience by far than Steny did, was basically a receptionist, and Steny got to deal with issues. Isn't that correct?
Yes, well, he did have a little bit of seniority on her, and he was in law school and had worked nights at the CIA. So it might not have been just gender bias that he was working on policy and she was in front answering the phones. But that may have been a part of it as well.
Well, I'm going to tell Steny when I see him that you made excuses for him. So that's fine. No, and I'm sure you're right about that. All right. So anyway, she's moving up. Uh, One wonders if the Democratic caucus had necessarily thought it through, that when they became a majority, eventually she would be Speaker. Was there a lot of opposition to her as she moved up the ladder? Who were her best friends and who were her, I wouldn't say enemies, but let's just say friendly opponents?
Well, Hoyer was definitely her principal rival, but it's significant that when she did try to move into leadership, she did not start on one of those lower rungs. In fact, she had repeatedly rejected offers to take over the Democratic campaign committee because she didn't want to be pigeonholed as a fundraiser and political operative. She wanted to be in real leadership, doing the policy work, the substantive work. So the first office that she ran for and eventually won when it came open was whip, which is the number 2 or 3 in the caucus, depending on whether you're in the majority. And so it did actually happen pretty quickly. She became whip in late 2001, and then minority leader, sorry, in 2003. And that put her in line to be speaker when and if the Democrats won the majority, which finally happened in 2006. But she was very good at building alliances with people. She, in that first race against Hoyer, got a lot of her support from the California delegation, which was a very large delegation in the Democratic Party, continues to be, and from the other women in the caucus. But one of her closest allies was a guy named Jack Murtha, who was a conservative Democrat, a sort of grizzled former Marine from rural Pennsylvania, who was known for his work on defense appropriations, on Pentagon spending. So this doesn't necessarily seem like the likeliest mentor for a San Francisco liberal, right? You've got Nancy Pelosi, who a lot of people reflexively dismissed as some kind of airhead or dilettante because she was a rich housewife who'd never been in office before, and had all these liberal positions, environmentalist and anti-war and all the rest. But Murtha saw something in her, and she realized the value of that relationship to her as well. And he became a very crucial sort of validator for her, because he could go over, there's an area of the House floor called the Pennsylvania Corner, where all of these sort of old boys used to gather. And he could go to them and say, she's not what you think. In fact, what he used to say about her was, don't think she's from San Francisco. She's from Baltimore. Yeah. And what he was saying was, she comes from that old school machine politics tradition. She knows how to play this game. And so he even told her when she started running for leadership, he said, don't lean on the woman thing, because there's not a lot of women around here. It's not going to get you much. She really had to show the men in the Congress that she could play on their playing field, and Murtha helped her do that. So I think Murtha was one of the really important relationships for her. I would call Steny a frenemy. The frenemy relationship with Hoyer was very important. And then in 2006, she worked with Rahm Emanuel to take back the House, which is a whole nother story, a whole chapter in the book. But that would have been a very important relationship for her as well.
Well, it's fascinating, and I'm so glad you brought up Murtha, because people don't understand this. They associate everything with ideology. And it doesn't work out that way. Both the House and the Senate are very personal institutions, and often the relationships surprise you. Let's move to her ascension to the speakership, because she was the first woman, still is the first woman ever to hold the speakership position, and is closer to the presidency than any woman has ever been. So the pressure on her was great in 2006, or when she actually took the oath in 2007. And she had a Republican president who was very unpopular with Democrats at the time. I guess he still is, but in relation to Trump, I've heard many Democrats say, could we get George W. Bush back? But that must have been a very critical moment for her. Can you describe that and what the relationship was like between Pelosi and Bush and others in the Bush administration?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because there are a lot of very fascinating parallels between the situation then and the situation now. She took the gavel with an unpopular Republican president, and having won those midterm elections largely on the strength of opposition to that president and his agenda, in that case, the Iraq War. So there was a wave of public discontent with the Iraq War. Jack Murtha had turned against the Iraq War very powerfully, and a lot of Americans had come to agree with him that the war was a bad idea and was being mismanaged. It's also sort of a parallel to when Republicans took the House in 2010. Her power to actually do what she'd campaigned on, to end the war, was pretty limited. And she had to figure out a way to try to work with the president where they shared common interests and goals, run the country, because the president and the Congress have got to work together to make the country run, to keep the government open and so on. But also to try to go toe-to-toe with him on the issues where they were opposed. So on the war, it was a series of really pitched battles, and it mirrors what's happening today, because on the one hand, she opposed President Bush and the war. On the other hand, the left always felt she wasn't going far enough. The left always felt that even when they were passing bills to, defund the war effort, there were protesters camped out in her yard in San Francisco because she refused to impeach him. And she did not do as many investigations, didn't prosecute him as harshly as they would like. So I think you can see a similar sort of balancing act that she's doing today, where she's doing too much for the right and not enough for the left. And she's got to find that sweet spot where she feels, it's often said that politics is the art of the possible. And she's always trying to maximize her leverage, achieve as much as possible, uh, but knowing what the limitations are and being realistic about it.
Of course, she had the leverage of the House, and you can't get anything passed without both houses, as we're learning again today. So I'm sure that helped. Did she find Bush, say, as opposed to Cheney or others, reasonable in negotiations? Did she have a good personal relationship with them?
Yeah, I think she did. I mean, she called him various names in the heat of the campaign, and she was very, very, very critical of everything from his intellect to his strategic acumen. They've since mended fences. They are now quite affectionate with each other, and I think hindsight is always rose tinted. There were some very acrimonious times, and the sort of crucial period at the end of the Bush administration, when the war that had been so front and center was eclipsed by the financial crisis. Bush at that point was so unpopular that he sort of absented himself. He kind of ghosted, to use a word your students will recognize.
Yes.
Uh, and left it up to his administration, chiefly Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, to the Treasury Secretary and Chair of the Fed, to figure out how to do the financial rescue effort. So she actually dealt much more with them in that sort of very politicized election year effort to bail out the economy, which also has a lot of parallels with what's happening today.
Yes, history is repeating. I'd like to think the result will be as positive, but I wonder. All right, let's move. Now, she went from the opposing party speaker working against the administration, or sometimes with them on the economic crisis, to Barack Obama. Now, what was the relationship like there? Uh, did she take, I've forgotten, did she take a stand between Obama and Clinton or just stay neutral?
She stayed neutral, and to the chagrin of many Clinton supporters, there was a point where, the Clinton Obama primary in 2008 dragged on, and some Clinton supporters, including Harvey Weinstein, were trying to get the super delegates together to make a last ditch push for Hillary at the convention, and Pelosi rebuffed those efforts, which sort of made her a hero to the Obama people.
Hmm.
But she and Obama didn't know each other well, right? He tried unsuccessfully to get a seat in the House, but he had only been in the Senate for a couple of years before he started running for president. She really liked what he represented. She liked him personally, and they always had a lot of respect for each other. But it was a pretty frustrating relationship over the course of the Obama administration, this was sort of a theme of the coverage of the Obama White House, was the frustrations of the Democrats in Congress, who never felt like he schmoozed them enough or paid them enough attention. But she also, she drives a very hard bargain, and a lot of the Democrats in Congress felt like Obama was not a great negotiator and tended to give away too much to the Republicans, tended to try too hard to achieve bipartisanship, which the Republicans weren't really interested in providing, rather than trying to get things done. So there's a moment when they're working to try to pass the Affordable Care Act, where Pelosi says to Rahm Emanuel, who had become the White House chief of staff, says, the president wants to get things done and be beloved. Which one does he want? Because you can't have both. And she and I think the portrait that really emerges from this book is that she's someone who'd always rather get things done than be beloved. And so the result of that, I think, is quite obvious. She's got a very long resume of accomplishments, and she's also one of the most polarizing figures in modern politics, and deeply unpopular in some quarters. So she's been willing to make that trade-off because she cares above all, I think, about results.
The Republicans have consistently, even back during the Bush administration, portrayed her as ultra liberal, a San Francisco Democrat. And yet, I think this comes through clearly in your book. she is actually, I'd say, a moderate liberal. She's not way on the left. And the people who are furthest on the left in the House caucus are opponents of hers in a way, or they're undermining her in various ways. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I've thought a lot about this. She's pretty complicated ideologically. She is a liberal. She's been from her first days in the House staunchly anti-war, staunchly in favor of gay rights. And I spent some time in the book talking about her record on human rights in China, which is a real passion of hers that a lot of people don't know about, and led her into some memorable clashes with the Clinton administration in the 90s. So yeah, I mean, she doesn't consider herself a socialist. She almost always has a further left opponent in San Francisco when she runs for reelection. But she's very much in the sort of progressive heart of the party, right? She really is, in addition to being a devoted partisan, is a devoted liberal in most ways. She's not as far left as maybe the so-called squad, but it's pretty revealing that the Congressional Progressive Caucus has a lot more members than just those 4 members of the squad, and so like the liberal heart of the party is not necessarily represented by that, what I think would call a small fringe.
I believe you asked her about the squad. How do you think of the squad? And she said, "Well, there are 4 members." Is
She
that
said
right?
that to Maureen Dowd, actually. Yeah, but she
Oh,
said, well, and it's funny because that comment, sort of went off like a grenade and made a lot of people angry. And but she was speaking quite literally. They were in the middle of an acrimonious legislative battle over border funding. And the only 4 Democrats to vote against the deal that Nancy Pelosi negotiated were the members of the squad. So what she was saying is, they're 4 people and that's how many votes they got. If there's so much support for their position, where is it?
for the
Because
vote.
I don't see it, right? If they
Right.
want to advance their position in the Congress, they need to find more votes. They need to rustle up those votes, because that's the way Nancy Pelosi thinks. It's always in terms of counting votes. And if you don't have the votes, you don't have the influence.
It's a very practical way of proceeding if you're Speaker. And of course, we know that after some successes and some failures during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, she lost the speakership in 2010, a Republican landslide in many ways, at least in the House. And that must have been a very difficult period for her. How did she describe it to you?
It's a really interesting turn of events. She had helped Obama get all of these legislative efforts over the line. She pushed a lot of things through the House that then didn't go anywhere because they died in the Senate, such as cap and trade, which environmentalists at the time criticized for not going far enough. But now it remains the only major climate legislation ever to pass a House of Congress. So, if anything, I don't think she has any regrets about how hard she pushed in those years. If anything, she wishes more people had pushed harder to get some of those things done. And she did. She told people at the time that she thought universal health care, the goal of Democratic presidents for the better part of a century, was important enough that if it meant losing the majority, it would be worth it. Now, who knows if she meant that, because she probably didn't think it was going to happen, right?
No,
She had a very large Democratic majority, and at first it seemed inconceivable that they could lose it. But one of the major features of that 2010 election cycle was the way that Nancy Pelosi became central to the Republicans' election strategy. And I described the way that sort of evolved, how they, despite, Obama being president and the economy still being pretty much in the dumps and this unpopular healthcare bill and everything else, it was really the image of Nancy Pelosi at the center of that congressional campaign. They spent $70 million that cycle alone on negative ads tying congressional candidates to Nancy Pelosi. Now, there's nothing unfair about this. Politics ain't beanbag. Democrats campaigned against Newt Gingrich back in the 90s, but there's never been an onslaught against a congressional leader of quite these proportions. And it really just came about because Republicans noticed that she got a rise out of people. When they brought her up, it just made people's blood boil, particularly among the sort of conservative base. And so they took that and ran with it, and she became the center of the Republicans' congressional election strategy for the better part of a decade. And whenever you ask her about that, about her sort of negative image, she says a couple of things. She says she doesn't care because it doesn't, her constituents are back in San Francisco and they're the House Democratic Caucus. So it doesn't really matter what people think about her everywhere else. But also she says that, they're against her because of her effectiveness. She really believes that, what she said to me was, if I weren't effective, I wouldn't be a target. And I think there's some truth to that, frankly, in part because she was the engine of things like uh, the Affordable Care Act, which, if you're a conservative, the creation of a massive new entitlement program that's going to be very difficult to undo, as we've seen. If Nancy Pelosi is the engine of that, then she is an enemy to the conservative movement, right? And so they targeted her and sort of never looked back.
In American history, there have been plenty of examples, actually, of speakers who've lost the speakership but stayed around and became speaker again in a few cases. Uh, it was interesting, though, that she didn't take that opportunity to retire. So many have when that happens. Um, was it that she had an agenda that she still wanted to enact? Did her caucus prevail upon her and insist that she was the one who could reunite them? And of course, it turned out that way in the end.
One of her former aides once described her motivations to me in a way that I've always remembered. He said everything for her comes down to this combination of obligation and self-confidence, maybe even entitlement. That she looked at the situation and said, well, somebody's got to do this. And then she looked around and said, well, I'm the one who can do it. And I think that applies to 2010 as well. I think there's an aspect of stubbornness. She's a very tenacious person, very strong-willed. But she also looked around and thought, well, somebody's still got to run the House Democratic Caucus. And who can do that better than I can? And so, she stuck around all those years, even as she became increasingly embattled within the caucus. Particularly, it sort of rose to a fever pitch with the efforts to oust her in 2016 and 2018. But all of those efforts were really just about how polarizing her persona was and how many negative ads were being run against her. It wasn't about who's the best person to run that House Democratic Caucus, who's the best person to negotiate with the president, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican president, who's the best person to shape these big complex pieces of legislation and get them through the Congress. No one ever really questioned that she was that person. It was more the outside perceptions that damaged her in people's eyes and caused a lot of angst within the Democratic Party about her.
Well, she had 8 years in the wilderness. There's no question about that. Again, I think that's difficult for anybody who's been at the top as she was, particularly during those first 2 years of the Obama administration. And she was the head of the caucus when they lost in 2010, and they lost in 2012, and they lost in 2014, and they lost in 2016. But she persisted. To use Hillary Clinton's phrase, she persisted. And then in 2018, it all came together. What was that like for her? How did she describe it to you?
Well, so there's a few things I think are significant about those 2018 midterms. One of them was, the rise of Trump, obviously, right? And not only that, but the wave of women's political activism that was really unprecedented, that started the day after Trump was elected. All of a sudden, I've been on panels for years where people fretted about how can we get more women to run for office? We just can't get them into the pipeline. And then overnight that problem disappeared, and you had thousands of women wanting to put their names on the ballot, wanting to fix what they saw as a messed up situation in Washington. So it is quite fitting that the first woman Speaker of the House would come back to power on this wave of women's activism. But she also was the strategic architect of the Democrats campaign strategy. The Republican strategy, once again, was put Nancy Pelosi in all the ads. But the Democratic strategy, she was very forceful in saying to all of the candidates that the party, recruited and coached, this can't be an election about Trump. This has to be an election about the things that we want to do that are constructive, that's policy. So it's healthcare, and jobs, and just a substantive message, and don't talk about Trump. So, and it's funny because that was the opposite strategy that she ran in 2006. In 2006, with an unpopular Republican president, the strategy was all about the Republican culture of corruption, and they barely talked about policy at all. But in 2018, she felt strongly that the message had to be about common sense, substantive policies for the Democrats, in order to avoid the perception that they didn't have anything that they believed in other than hating Trump. So that, who knows if that was a successful strategy or if they would have won anyway. If political scientists like yourself study these kinds of things all the time, and the president's party usually loses seats in a midterm, so who knows how much any of this strategy had to do with it. But I think she looks at that as having been a successful strategy, and you can see her still saying the same things today about how the party needs to run in 2020, that the Democrats have to offer an alternative. And you see what she's doing in the House, where a lot of the left would prefer that she just try to stop Trump at all costs. They would have liked her to start impeachment much sooner and make the oversight effort much more aggressive. And she's obsessed with trying to show America that Democrats are interested in governing. The Democrats' first priority is getting legislation passed and improving people's lives, not prosecuting the president.
Molly, we're going to shortly go to some of the questions that have been submitted to us in advance, and also audience questions that are coming in across our live stream. But we have to focus on Pelosi and Trump, because I don't think there's ever been quite this kind of relationship between a president and a speaker. And it isn't just one dimensional. They have some respect for one another in a political sense and what they were able to actually accomplish. On the other hand, there's that image of Nancy Pelosi standing up to Trump in the White House, and also the one that I think will be remembered by history, Nancy Pelosi ripping up the State of the Union address right after it was over, demonstrating precisely what she and probably almost all Democrats thought of it. Tell us some of what you learned. You've got so much in the book, and the book is called Pelosi, and the publisher is Henry Holt. And while I don't want you leaving us right now, the instant this is over, you need to go to Amazon.com and order it. Getting back on track here, tell us a little bit about that relationship, Pelosi and Trump.
Thank you so much for the plug. I appreciate it. So they don't have much of a personal relationship these days. They haven't spoken in months, but from the very beginning, you could see that she had the ability to get under his skin, right? And he periodically, the president doesn't leave any thought unexpressed on Twitter. He has tweeted at various times that his sort of grudging respect for her. In fact, when she was when she was trying to regain the speakership in 2018 after the midterms, he tweeted that he supported her, that she deserved to be speaker again, and even said maybe the Republicans can give her the votes to do it, which neither she nor the Republicans were interested in that happening. But there's that. The image on the cover is from that famous meeting on the cover of my book, the famous meeting in December 2018. The Democrats have already won the midterms. She's struggling to regain the speakership, win over all of the House Democrats, convince them to put her back in charge. She and Chuck Schumer walk into the White House for a negotiation to avoid a government shutdown. And President Trump invites the cameras unexpectedly to stay and film this discussion instead of having it be a closed door negotiation. And as they're talking about the border wall and the prospect of a shutdown and so on, Trump, as a sort of insulting aside, says, well, Nancy's not in a very good position to talk right now, referring to the leadership battle. And this is where you see her interrupt him, put her hand out and say, Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory. So I think what you see there is she's always been willing to stand up to powerful men. Even if it means that she has to interrupt them, she asserts herself. She stands up for herself, and and I think he's a little bit afraid of her for that reason, because he knows that she knows what she's doing and she does not back down. And so that is the meeting that then, she and Schumer walked out of the meeting, and she put on that red coat and the sunglasses and had that little smile on her face. And you just saw on Twitter and elsewhere the explosion of these memes about her, right? And it clearly was because so many Democrats, so many people on the left were just hungry to see anybody stand up to President Trump. And so finally they'd seen someone do that to his face in person. It was tremendously, I think, emotionally satisfying for liberals to see that, but also her in particular, a powerful woman, an accomplished woman who wasn't going to take any crap. I think that resonated with a lot of women all over the place. Just the strength that she showed. So it to me is symbolic of the way her image has completely turned around in the past couple of years, right? She was sort of treated as this relic, this polarizing, unlikable figure, and then all of a sudden, since she's come back into the speakership, she's become this sort of resistance icon and the subject of all of these memes and all of this admiration, kind of in the vein of like an RBG, right? And it's because of those qualities that she's always epitomized. Is just that people have sort of woken up to them now.
What about the ripping up of the State of the Union address?
So that didn't make it into the book. It was a little too late. I'll have to put it in the paperback edition. But I've seen all kinds of theories about why she did that. I have not had an opportunity to ask her, but others have, and I think she's telling the truth when she says that was not a premeditated moment. It wasn't some kind of political strategy to detract from the president's glorious and wonderful speech so that nobody would notice how glorious and wonderful it was and refocus attention on her and conflict and so on. She really just felt that, the speech was littered with falsehoods, but also the president had sort of put on this show in the House chamber, right? This is after this is not the one that she postponed. That was in 2019 during the shutdown. But what we learned during that shutdown, right, is that the House has to invite the president to come give the State of the Union. It's this sort of gracious, traditional, ceremonial gesture. So by turning it into a sort of a campaign rally, having all these people stand up and be recognized, and giving the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh right there on the spot, I think she was, as an institutionalist, a little bit offended by the spectacle of it as well as the content of the speech. And so I think, another thing that I feel like I learned in my reporting on her, she does have a bit of a temper, and she's usually a quite disciplined, quite controlled person. But in this case, I think she really just was offended by the speech, and she expressed that.
Well, it was a theatrical moment, but also a historical one. No one's ever done that before. And I have to agree with you. I think it was spontaneous. She was sitting there steaming during the speech, and it was obvious that she was. And at a certain point, she wanted to let that steam out, and that's how it was. I'm going to ask the first question submitted to us in advance, and then I'm going to go to one of our Center for Politics staff members, Elliot Sperling, for something that's come in on live stream. I have been paying attention to you. I haven't been paying attention to the live stream. We had a couple of questions about the fact, and I hope this isn't ageist, Nancy Pelosi in March turned 80. It's looking younger and younger to me. I don't think there's a thing wrong with someone in a major position at the age of 80. But it does raise a logical question, which is, both parties, in a sense, have very senior leaders. Let's put it that way, in their 70s or even 80. When do you think she might step down? Do you think let's suppose that Biden defeats Trump. Would she want to be part of that 2 years stay in, or would she prefer to leave at a moment of triumph and hand it to somebody else? What do you think she'll do?
I have no idea, and it is something that she does not talk about. But I do have some clues. When the Democrats lost the election in 2016, she said to me and some others that she would have considered stepping down if Hillary Clinton had won, because there would have been a woman at the table. Keep in mind, when the president meets with the senior leaders of Congress in the White House, she's the only woman who's ever been in that room. And without her, there would not be any women in that room. And that really is important to her. So at the same time, nobody heard her say that before the election in 2016. So who knows if that was something she really had planned or just something she said after the fact. But with Trump in there, I think she didn't feel she had any choice but to stay. And now, she has once again seen her desire for a female president thwarted, and but she did. In the course of those negotiations in 2018 to get the speakership back, a lot of the angst in the Democratic caucus. It isn't just about how old she and Steny Hoyer and the whip Jim Clyburn are. It's how long they've been there, right? Even if they were all 20 years younger, the fact that those three have been in charge of the House Democrats for more than 15 years now. That's a long time if you're an ambitious junior member of the House to wait around for something to open up so that you can move up, so that you can be a leader. So we've seen a lot of promising House members decide to leave instead because it just doesn't look like that is ever going to open up. And that means that really stifles the sort of the bench of the party. So one of the things that she finally accepted in the negotiations in 2018 was a term limit. So it's a 4-term limit on all of the House leadership. It's not binding. It didn't end up making it into the actual rules, but she did accept it. And that would mean that she would have to step down in 2022. And the story I recount in the book for the first time is that she actually told people at the time, well, I was planning on leaving after 1 term. So to have 2 terms, that's no problem. Now, she's a tenacious person. She's stuck around when people didn't expect her to in the past. So who knows what wellspring of feelings of obligation she might feel after the election in 2020. I can't predict what she's going to do, but at least in 2018 she was seeing this as a sort of swan song. And it has been interesting to watch her lead the Democrats in this moment, and to see a lot of the people who were against her come around and really applaud her leadership because of the way she's kept the Democrats together in the Trump era.
You've offered a very interesting point, though, Molly, about no woman in the room. If Biden is elected, we know there will be a woman in the room. She'll be the vice president. So that might be a factor in Nancy Pelosi's decision. There would be a woman in the room, even if she were not there.
Well, you know as well as I do that the vice president doesn't necessarily get to be in that room.
Well, true. I think this time the vice president.
But yes,
will. I really do.
Yes, I think that might actually weigh on her decision.
So, well, that's interesting. All right, Elliot, what do we have from the live stream questions?
Great. I'll follow up with something similar to what you were just talking about. Molly, is there a favorite to replace Pelosi as the Democratic leader in the House whenever she does decide to step down? And do you know if she might have someone that she prefers to take over?
No, there's not a favorite, and she has not groomed a successor. And this has frequently been a criticism of her, that she hasn't sort of cultivated the next generation. She believes, she had to fight her way into leadership. Therefore, it's up to whoever wants to be speaker next to do the same thing. It's not up to her to sort of help somebody get there. And she has when I once actually asked her this question directly, like, why aren't you grooming someone to take over for you? And she said, well, it was Chris Van Hollen, and then he left. He was a congressman from Maryland who, having grown frustrated with the bottleneck in-house leadership, left to run for a Senate seat when one became available, and he's now in the Senate. So there are various prospects people talk about. The younger members of the leadership team now, someone like Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark from Massachusetts. There are a few prominent Democrats in the younger generation who people sort of have their eye on. But Pelosi has never sent a signal about who she might prefer. And a lot of people think that even though he's as old as she is, that Steny Hoyer might still have his eye on the speakership. And that part of the reason she sticks around might just be so that he can't have it, because they have had this decades-long rivalry. Neither of them would admit to that, but the third in command, Jim Clyburn, says, I think when one of us leaves, all of us leave. And most people think that that's the most realistic scenario. That whole top Democratic leadership team will leave together, and it'll be up to the next generation to sort of make the caucus their own.
Let me follow up. This is a non sequitur, but I was fascinated with the section you had about Nancy Pelosi's views on China, shaped by her presence at the Tiananmen disaster in the late 80s. Do you think there's any room there, understanding that President Trump is trying to pass the blame to China, but China does have some blame for what's happened? Is there room there for a bipartisan effort to rein in China?
I doubt it, just because bipartisanship is not really the name of the game these days, right? The parties have been able to team up on these massive coronavirus release bills, but even that has been a struggle. And her opposition to the Chinese regime has been about trade, and it has been about human rights. And she has been. It is one of my favorite sort of lesser known anecdotes of the book, when she and a couple of other members went to Tiananmen Square in 1991 and actually stood up to the Chinese authorities. And one of her companions at the time had played Cooter in The Dukes of Hazzard, and then became a Democratic congressman. Just a fun fact there. But that was a tremendously bold thing to do, to evade the Chinese authorities and then put this in their faces. And they were chased out of Tiananmen Square by the Chinese police. So all that being said, I think the focus of any bipartisanship in Congress right now is on the coronavirus relief legislation. And there's not a lot of bandwidth for anything else, particularly with the House not even being physically present. But there is some ideological overlap there. The other thing that we've seen in the Trump-Pelosi relationship, though, is that it's really, as I said, deteriorated. She has continued to express a willingness to work with the president, but it is not a two-way street. And he got up in one of their meetings last year and said, I can't talk to you as long as this witch hunt is still going on. And he has basically made it clear he refuses to deal with her now that she's impeached him, and prior to that, while the Russia investigation was happening. So, she's very cold-blooded about these things, very professional. She's willing to go to the table and try to find mutual interests, even with people she's not particularly fond of. But the president is not. The president's personal feelings apparently come first in that regard. And other members of his administration, notably the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, have kept up that relationship and work with Speaker Pelosi quite well. But with President Trump in particular, he just has decided that relationship is over.
Other than Mnuchin, is there somebody else, or maybe more than one person, in the Trump administration that Pelosi can work with or deals with on a regular basis?
I think Mnuchin has really become the point person, has become her favorite. Last year when they were working on the budget, notice there has not been another government shutdown since Nancy Pelosi retook the gavel. And that's because they managed to pass a budget, which didn't used to be an amazing thing for Congress to do, but in this day and age it is. And that was negotiated with Secretary Mnuchin, in part because she considered the former budget director and chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who had been a sort of Tea Party congressman, she found him too unreasonable and she wouldn't deal with him. Mm. And so the administration brought in Mnuchin instead, and they've developed a very productive relationship. And so it was a continuation of those budget negotiations from last year that enabled them to work together on all the coronavirus legislation this year. And the negotiations now seem a little bit stalled. It seems like they're all sort of staking out negotiation positions in public rather than actually getting in that room. But that's sort of just the first round of the battle, and I think they'll get in there and find a way to do something again.
Elliot, go with another question from live stream.
Great. Here's another one. As we mark the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, From your vantage point, what challenges still exist for women in politics and, in your case, in journalism?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one of the real hallmarks of Nancy Pelosi's career is just how she spent so much time struggling to be taken seriously by the male dominated establishment. And I think every woman has felt that in one way or another. Has felt like you just had to work a little bit harder for people to pay attention to your brain instead of everything else. And but I think she's broken a lot of those barriers. And I think the way that she's done it as a woman is really interesting, right? She she has a lot of women politicians have sort of tried to impersonate a man in order to get themselves taken seriously and in order to be seen as legitimate. So, famously in 2008, Hillary Clinton ran as a sort of Margaret Thatcher type character, this sort of hawkish and almost masculine political persona. But and a lot of women politicians in the past, were reluctant to talk about their husbands or their families or their children for fear that it would make them seem soft or get them trivialized. Nancy Pelosi's never done that. She's always really foregrounded her family. She's always foregrounded, her concern about America's children and the children of the world. She would say. At the same time, she hasn't done a lot of what's traditionally regarded as sort of women's work in Congress, right? She hasn't mostly worked on things related to like education and health and so on. The committees that she was on were the sort of hard committees, the budgeting and the military type committees. So it's a really interesting to me intersection of femininity and strength that she represents, and I think that is something that's made her a role model to a lot of women these days as well.
Well, Molly, one thing I know for sure, having listened to you during this wonderful live stream, everybody who's on this live stream is going to take you seriously and this wonderful book seriously. And I want to thank you so much for your time and urge everyone looking for a way to fill a couple of hours intelligently to go to Amazon.com and other book sources and buy Pelosi. You can't forget the title. It's Pelosi. It really is worth your while. And you're going to learn a lot about Nancy Pelosi and American politics and government that you didn't know before. I guarantee you. Please do so. Molly, we look forward to seeing you on the trail. Wish you luck with your already very successful career, and it will be even more successful in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you for that ringing endorsement. It may find its way onto the next edition of the book.
No charge. Absolutely no charge.
The check's in the mail.
That's checks in the mail, and they're not delivering anymore. So what the heck? Okay, thanks a lot, Molly, and we'll see all of you for the next edition to be announced of the Center for Politics live stream. Have a wonderful day.